The fog lay on the Bay of Seals like unshorn wool, heavy and damp, at once muffling and magnifying every sound. The ferric rasp of a chain, the whisper of oars that were never seen, the low groan of ice shifting under the skin of the tide. The watchman on Eastwatch's seaward wall had been staring into that fog since moonset, more from habit than hope, for this was no season for fishermen or merchants, and even raiders from the Skirling Pass kept their distance when the water smoked and froze as if a breath colder than winter exhaled from underneath. Yet just before dawn an outline separated itself from the gray. A skiff, low in the water, moving with a steady obedience to each small pull of a single oar. "Who goes there?" cried the first man who saw it, his voice eaten at the edges by the fog. It was the sort of call the wall had known for thousands of nights, but it felt thin in the wide hush. The skiff's occupant did not answer at once. He lifted the oar, laid it on the thwarts, and took up the pole to fend off a run of black ice. When he rose in the skiff, the watchers leaned forward as if the act itself drew them. He was tall, not with the oversized heaviness of the free folk, but with the balance of a blade that had once been weighed for perfection. He wore a cloak of winter gray over mail that had known salt and sand as much as snow. The links were polished dull, the kind of dull that comes of careful hands. At his hip was a sword in a plain sheath, but the pommel, wrapped in faded leather, caught a breath of dawn and gave it back as a soft, pearly glow. The light did not flare or flash. It seemed instead to wake. He pulled the skiff in under the wharf and tied off without looking up at the men staring down at him. He moved with an ease that suggested he had once tied off 100 such boats and never meant to make a show of it. When he finally raised his face to them, there was nothing of triumph or request in his expression. It was composed, almost serene, and Weather could write no lines on a face that had been taught to keep its own counsel. His hair, dark as a wet raven's wing and threaded with silver, had been cut close. The stubble along his jaw looked rough on a man who wore order like another skin. His eyes were not the pale lavender some men claim of those with the blood of high Valyria, nor the sunshot gold of Dornish princes. They were gray and clear and the color of winter stone. "I would speak to the lord of this place," he said, and the voice was patient and even, the voice of a man who had given commands and obeyed them, and would do either again if need asked. "There's no lord here," one of the brothers said after a moment. "Only a commander, and he's at Castle Black." "Then I will speak to him there. You're not walking that road without a welcome to pass. Your name, friend?" Another called down. "We've work enough with dead men who say nothing." "I am no dead man," the newcomer replied, and there was the smallest curl of wryness at the corner of his mouth, as if he recognized an old joke and was content to play his part in it. "I come to take service, if service will have me. My name," he paused, not from uncertainty but from respect. He had known the power of names. He had worn one like a standard. "I was called Arthur Dayne." The name touched the men on the wall like a wind, passing along them, lifting a few hairs, making a few shoulders draw tight beneath their black. That name had a shape to it, the confluence of tales told in warmer rooms than this, of tournaments under summer skies and of a slim, pale sword in a hand that was said to be quicker than sunlight on water. Some of the watchmen had not been born when that sword last sang in honest battle, and yet their fathers had muttered the name when the hearth burned low. The oldest among them shut his eyes. He had once seen white cloaks, bright as gulls, sweeping through the crowd at Sunspear, and a young knight carrying a blade that looked stolen from dawn. "You're dead," one of the younger men said, because it was a thing he had been told, and he had learned to hold tight to instruction in a world that was always falling out of the hands of reasonable men. "So I have been told," the man in the skiff answered. It would not be the first time word outran a man's feet. "Will you lower me a rope ladder, or do I climb?" They lowered a ladder. He climbed with the same measured ease with which he had tied off his boat. The weight of years did not announce itself with even a single misstep. On the planks he stood without ostentation and unfastened his gray cloak. The watchers noticed the sword hilt better up close. They noticed too that he wore no sigil. A plain cloak, plain mail, plain leather scabbard with a small star scratched near the throat with a knife point. like a man's private mark in a ledger. "What would the watch want with a Southron tale come flesh?" the old watchman asked, his voice respectful out of habit, not fear. "All the tales we're fighting now come down on the wind of the north. There's one tale that is older than all," said the man they had known once as the Sword of the Morning. "It is the tale of an oath that holds a place against the dark for those who cannot. That tale runs true on both sides of winter. I have come for the oath." They took his sword first, because that is what a careful brother does when a man comes to join a house of men and weapons. He surrendered it without reluctance, and the act did not make him smaller. When the blade was drawn to be looked upon, light gathered along its length as dew gathers, not from within but as if the steel remembered mornings with the tenderness of an old hound. The edge carried no line of dark ripples like Valyrian steel, and yet it felt old, older than the hot forge of men, older even than the pride of any house. "We are told this blade was forged from a fallen star," said the old watchman softly, not out of doctrine but beck. As he wished to speak the words aloud once, the way a man will whisper the name of a girl he did not marry when he sees his reflection grown older. "We are told it passed to you by right." "I was given leave to bear it," the newcomer replied. "Even that grant is not forever. If I am welcomed among you, the blade may be hung where the watch keeps its treasures, until our need calls for it." "Our need calls for every blade," the old man said, handing the sword back almost reluctantly, as if he feared for his own fingers. "Come inside and warm yourself. I'll send a raven to the Lord Commander. If you are who you say, he'll want to speak with you himself." "Should I give him a name to write on his parchment?" asked Arthur Dayne. "Our Lord Commander is the Snow Boy," replied the old man, with a certain affection that old soldiers can afford. "Jon Snow. He's earned his way and more besides. He won't be moved by old stories, mind you." "Nor should he," said Arthur. "Old stories are a burden. It is the living who make a way through night." He ate stew that tasted of herring and onions and a hint of smoke that came from the fish being dried too close to the hearth. He listened to the house's life. The thud of boots knocking snow from the stalls, the hollow note of iron being set down on a bench, a burst of laughter that was too loud because men laughed that way on purpose to keep fear out of the corners where it made nests. He kept his face still when they asked questions a man asks by not asking them. "Where have you been? Why did you not die when death is a diligent hunter? What business do you have in a house that serves neither prince nor lady?" And he answered none but the ones put to him simply, that he had come up by the last river, that he had weathered the Skirling Pass with 3 men and buried 2 on the slope, that he had eaten seal and kelp and once a strip of his own boot, boiled until it softened to something his stomach could be fooled by, that he wished for the oath as a man wishes for bread at the end of a winter's day. The raven they sent west to Castle Black returned the next morning with a new strip of parchment tied under the black silk. The message was brief. Bring him. The boy who had become the man who commanded had no use for flourish. The road from Eastwatch to Castle Black is a hard white scar dug into the shoulder of the world, and the wall on its left is a presence the way an old injury is a presence, throbbing when storms come in. Arthur Dayne rode a shaggy dun that had no name yet and was too sensible to spook at the height of the wall's blue-white face. He rode with 2 brothers he had met the night past and had learned to like, a spear tower man whose hands were cracked and raw but uncomplaining, and a boy from the fingers of the Vale who had lied about his age and performed the lie well enough that his lie had become a kind of truth. The wind came out of the west, thin and piercing enough to make the tears it drew feel like nails. He rode with his cloak knotted tight, his face bare. He liked the cold, clarified. He had been called a dozen things: knight, lord, traitor, hero. He had been the young prince's hand upon the reins, and he had seen that prince's life end in water as red as the banners men waved when they said the gods had given them victory. He had stood between a lady and a lord with the whole of a war caught in the small space between, and he had chosen a side and borne the choice. He had bled enough that his body did not take delight in bleeding again. He had loved precisely twice, and the second love had lost him his name. None of these things were important in the saddle beneath the wall. The breath of the horse was important, the strange glassy whisper of the wall's face when the wind cut across. The crusting of ice along his bridle, the way his lips went numb, the way the sky was so wide it made thought small. They reached Castle Black at dusk. The fire behind the arrow slits stacked along the main hall looked no warmer than a painting of fire. The gate was open because the watch knows what a closed gate says to men who have been walking against a wind that seeks the marrow. Arthur dismounted and led his dun into the outer yard, handed the reins to a boy whose red hands were more scar than skin, and walked toward the carved door. The man who came to meet him wore his youth like a second blade. His cloak was black, like all the brothers, but a white direwolf loped at his side, as silent as frost. The animal's eyes were the color of a winter moon when wind has scoured the sky clean. The young man's eyes were not. They were dark and uncertain when he turned his thoughts inward, and solid when he looked on a matter that required his hand. He had a scar along his cheek that Arthur recognized at once as the souvenir of a lesson learned at the wrong end of a blade, and the way the man carried his left shoulder told him one old wound still made itself known when it snowed. "I'm told you claim the name Arthur Dayne," the young man said without ceremony. He did not offer his hand in welcome. Neither did he let his hand fall to his sword hilt the way men do when they think they are making a point but in truth are telling you they are afraid. "I claim nothing," Arthur answered. "I give it back for others to name. But I was called that once. And you've come to take the oath?" "I have come to be asked and to answer." Jon Snow, because there was no mistaking him once a man had seen his face, regarded him a long moment. He had learned the patience of command from hardship, which is the only teacher that never forgets its pupils. "Come into the hall," he said at last. "We'll talk after you've eaten. There's stew left. I ate at Eastwatch, but I'll sit." They sat beneath beams that had seen a dozen ages of winter, beams so old that even woodworms did not dare hope for more than a season or two along the grain. Men came and went about the bus, Innes of a house that had never known the soft carelessness of a lord's court, a blacksmith with shoulders like two anvils and hands that moved with a tenderness that would have surprised his mother, if he had one, a gray, osprey-like steward who knew how many loaves had been baked without asking because he could smell when the ovens ran too hot for too long, a rangy man with a face like a hatchet, watching every movement with a kind of defensive humor. Arthur could feel them watching him by not watching him, a trick he had known at court where not seeing was an art. A girl's laughing voice drifted from somewhere too near for comfort, and Arthur's eyes flickered, but Jon Snow did not need to explain. He had made bargains that sat badly with men who believed that old dangers were better company than new ones. Arthur could smell the rich, torn leather scent of those bargains on the air, and a second scent underneath, the iron of fear and a salt bitter enough to be grief. "Why take the black?" Jon asked when the hall had quieted enough that their words would not need to shout. "You had your life to the south. I'm told it was a grand life once. I won't pretend I know it. We hear many stories, and stories change with the weather. A man does not keep the world out by changing the kindling," Arthur said. "I lived long enough with a white cloak to learn that color is poor armor against the failure of men. I swore once to guard a prince's life with mine, and I learned that no single life is worth the making of a world. I swore to guard a kingdom that no longer knows its own shape, and I learned that the shape of any kingdom is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep. The wall is not a lie. It is a thing built against an old truth. I have stood too long behind the lesser things. There is a greater night, and I would stand a while before it." "You speak like a man on a horse who's seen 3 roads and knows none of them are kind," Jon said. "I speak like a man who wants the simplest road at last. The Night's Watch has rules older than both of us," Jon said. "A man gives up lands and titles he possesses and refuses all that might be given. You have carried a blade that belongs to a house. Will you part with it? The blade was given for duty and must be returned to duty." Arthur's thumb brushed the leather of the hilt, an affectionate gesture that a friend might have envied. "If I am sworn, the sword will be the watch's, to hang until it is needed. If I am denied, I will carry it back to Starfall and lay it on the stone where it lay when I was a boy, a feat I cannot perform because I have no welcome there. So you see, Lord Commander, I am a man without a shelf to place his old life upon. You will be doing me a kindness to relieve me of it." "I am no lord," Jon Snow said, almost irritably, as men do when a title they have earned still sits uncomfortably on the shoulders of the boy they were. "I'm a keeper of fires and a measurer of oats." Arthur glanced about the hall. The faces that turned away and then turned back when they knew he saw them. The stoop of men who had been told all their lives to bend around and not against. The wide-eyed stare of boys who were looking at a story and trying to measure themselves against it. He looked at the white wolf lying as if carved at the young man's feet. "You are what this house needs you to be," he said. "At present, that seems to be a mark for every man's eye. I have some practice at being such a mark. If you allow me here, I will try to take some of that from you. I have a back that has learned to carry it." Jon's mouth twitched, an almost smile quickly lost. "We have too many burdens to trade them like hats, but I'll test your word. We're not so rich in the north that we can turn away a blade and a heartbeat besides. If you speak your oath by morning and break it by noon, I'll find a rope with your name in it." "That is fair," Arthur said. "I have rarely found it so." He slept that night in a narrow bed that had once held a boy who snored like a small bellows and had scratched his initials under the frame. He lay with his hands folded on his chest like a statue in a sept and listened to Castle Black breathe. Men murmured in sleep. A log split with a sound like a small salute. Somewhere a pot lid did that faint trembling they do when a stew is just at the edge of boil. In his mind he turned and turned the old blade under winter stars, because habit is an animal that lies down with its head on a man's boots and will not be moved. He was woken before dawn by the gray man with the osprey features, who nodded at him like an equal and did not waste words on a man who had asked for none. They met in the old yard, where the snow had been tramped to a hard, gray surface and the ghosts of 100 drills clung to the stones like breath that could not find its way out. Men gathered as if drawn by weather. A few free folk came, their faces carved by wind and laughter, which often carved together. Jon Snow stood across from him and recited in an even voice the promise that every brother had spoken: to serve without wife or child, to hold no lands, to take no part in squabbles that warmed men's tents while the true cold came on. Arthur Dayne repeated the words without poetry, and yet each word in his mouth was a carefully placed stone. He did not fix his eyes anywhere but on the young man's face. When it was done, there was no cheer. The watch did not cheer. A few men breathed out as if they had been keeping their lungs full against the chance that breath might be a luxury again. The hatchet-faced man shook his head as if making a private joke and then broke into a grin that made boys in the back glance at one another with relief. The wolf rose, stretched, patted over, and sniffed Arthur's hand once, cold nose touching his skin. The wolf's eyes were level with his own. Arthur reached out and let his fingers settle for an instant along the ruff. The white anima. El accepted the touch with the dignity of a small god. "Now you're ours," said the rangy man with the hatchet face, stepping up to clap him on the shoulder. "Which means you'll be chopping ice if the Lord Commander says ice and spearing whales if he says whales. Though between us I hope he never says whales. My name is Ed," he added when Arthur looked at him with a question in his expression. "They call me a great many other things, but until you've once seen me make porridge, you can keep those names in your mouth where they belong." "Then I greet you, Ed," Arthur said. "Don't threaten me with politeness," Ed muttered, and the corners of his eyes creased in secret amusement. "Now that you're sworn, some men might make you prove yourself by taking a long walk to look for dead things. I, on the other hand, will make you prove yourself by taking a long walk to the armory, where we keep our further miseries." Arthur Dayne learned the rhythms of this new life with the stubborn eagerness of a man who has found at last the kind of work his hands were always meant for. He practiced before breakfast with a pair of brothers who were better with the spear than they realized, because no one had told them they were. He sat with the builders and asked questions until they remembered that a true question is an honor, not an inspection. He spoke to a band of free folk women with hair like old rope and eyes like bright knives and asked them to show him how they threw their short darts from the thongs of leather they wore around their wrists. He listened to the stories of the men in the kitchens, and on the third morning told them one of his own, about a day in the Red Mountains when the wind descended into a canyon and filled it so full with sand that it rose like a wave and the horses lay down and let it pass over them. He told it without embellishment or lesson, and because he asked for nothing with his story, they gave him nothing in return but their time, which is the coin worth most in a house like this. If he felt the eyes of old enemies upon him, he gave them no attention. Those enemies were not men with swords. They were memory and regret, and in this place even those enemies forgot to keep their blades sharp because the cold was a more urgent foe. Besides, it is difficult to argue with a man who will clean the drains in the yard with a shovel and then go directly to the library to help straighten the piles of moldy parchment a careful boy left stacked in nervous order. The days shifted into one another in a pattern you could see forming under your hands like knitting. The outriders brought word of odd weather in the haunted forest, a silence that fell fast and hard, a kind of listening that was not their own. Ravens returned with their letters frostburnt to the string. The builder's hands cracked and bled. So did the skin at the corners of Arthur Dayne's mouth, and he wore the scab like a red comma. The wolf ghost came and went, appearing in the yard like a sliver of midnight cut free and drifted into the light to see what men were doing. And all the while Jon Snow stood at the center of the web and did not sleep enough. He had the look of men who lay down with their boots on and an ear open. The first true test presented itself in the form of a man in a black cloak and a face like unbaked bread who came into the hall while men were still shaking snow from their eyebrows. He had ridden from the gorge and had not paused to eat, which in the Watch's language meant his news had teeth. "Hard home," he said, and even the free folk in the room stopped their murmuring. The word was a place name in the mouth and something worse in the mind. The dead are walking there like driftwood. There's smoke over the ice and the sea won't let men leave. They pile rafts and the rafts sink, or the rafts drift into shadow and don't come out. Those who landed and ran into the trees we haven't seen since. The few that made it to the little strand near Grey Gulls told us they saw blue riders on the ridge as the light went, and the air went sharp then, like a breath that cut you on the way in. The hall was very quiet. Someone set a spoon down, and the sound rang like a bell. Jon Snow stood without haste. "Get warm," he told the messenger. "Eat, then find me with a clear head and tell me everything you can remember twice over." He looked at Arthur Dayne after the man had been led away and held his gaze as if testing it. When he spoke again, the words were for everyone. "We knew this was coming," he said. "We thought we had a season before we had to say it aloud. We do not. If there are souls to be taken off that beach, I mean to take them. If there are dead to be burned, we burn them. We'll need ships. We'll need men who can run on ice and men who can breath smoke. Tormund." He turned his head and a giant of a free folk man grinned from where he'd been leaning against a pillar like an idle storm. "Get your people ready for a boat they'll hate and a fight they'll like less. Bowen, I want counts, ropes, oil, pitch, the new nets. Othell, those towers we talked of that make their own heat. If they're to be anything but talk, I need them yesterday. Ed, tell the kitchens to make food that men can eat with one hand while the other holds on." He did not turn to Arthur Dayne, not yet. A leader lets the man who is watching him wait to be named, so that when the naming comes it has weight. When at last he did, it was not with order but with consideration. "You asked to stand in the cold with us," Jon said. "There's cold enough to go around." "I'll take the first boat," Arthur said. "But there will be men here who will not forgive you the leaving. A commander who leaves sometimes returns to find he has to win his seat again. You need someone who can sit in your chair and say the things with your weight. You volunteer for that chair as readily as the boat," said Ed dryly. "I have learned that a chair can so. Me times be the more perilous voyage," Arthur replied. It was a simple exchange and ordinary, but a few men standing near enough to hear looked sideways at one another because they recognized in the careless shape of the words a matter that was about to become a structure. They did not make that structure at once. The first things to be built were the boat lists and the rope coils and the bundles of pitch-sealed arrows. Arthur Dayne stood shoulder to shoulder with free folk and brothers hammering together the rough shelters that would be loaded whole into a ship and pulled ashore at Hardhome for a quick refuge, knowing it would be lost and building it anyway. He stood with the quartermaster until an argument that had worn grooves into the floorboards this past fortnight finally gave way, not to surrender but to acceptance. He carried bundles over ice without slipping. He taught 3 boys a knot they did not know that would hold in sleet when another knot failed. He ate his stew burning hot while standing and passed his spoon once to a girl who had not been given one because she had been mistaken for a visitor and not a fighter. And when he could, he spoke to Jon Snow in the narrow space behind the great hall where men came to whisper because the draft turned back on itself there and the wind did not bother about trailing their words away over the yard. "They will ask you to be 2 men at once," Arthur said. "The man who sits and the man who sails. They will rob both men of his full strength. They will do it not because they are false but because they are tired and frightened. You must choose which you will be this season and forgive yourself for not being the other." "You speak like a man who has stood on both sides of a wound," Jon replied. "I don't know that there is a choice. I feel the pull of the shore and the pull of the hall both, and the rope will cut me if I try to serve both ends." "Then we tie another rope," Arthur said simply. He said nothing more just then. The next day he hung his sword in the armory with the watch's other odd beauties. A halberd with a raven carved along the shaft and an axe head etched with the square script of the Summer Isles. He wrote in a precise hand on a strip of leather and tied it around the hilt, not with his name but with a single star and the date. He took down instead a long sword of northern make, good work, unpretentious, with a balance that reminded him of wall stones laid true. He strapped it on without ceremony and went out to the yard. When the ships stood off in the bay like dark bread loaves set to rise, Arthur Dayne climbed the gangplank with Ed behind him, complaining about everything except the only things worth complaining about. Tormund heaved aboard in a shower of snow, a laugh booming out of him that a man could stand under like shelter. Men who had never been on water before made jokes too loudly and were sick too soon, and the sea grew a choppy skin as if preparing itself for play. Jon Snow stood on the quay and watched them go with all the calm a man can teach his face when his heart is on those planks. Beside him stood a woman in red who watched with a different hunger, one that seemed to eat the cold instead of the other way round. Her eyes were old and new at once. When she saw Arthur Dayne look back over his shoulder, she lifted her hands a breath, as if blessing something she had not been given authority over. "You see omens everywhere," Jon told her without moving his head. "Only because they see me," she replied. "That man is a sword someone tempered on a different fire than most. He's ours now. Your words have weight," she said, and her voice made him think of fires banked deep, of coals that are red long after the flame has been forgotten. "It is perhaps time to think that weight might be shared." "I have been thinking of nothing else," Jon admitted. Hardhome rose out of the fog not as a shape but as a smell. The stink of old smoke and cold flesh, the Swedish rot that comes of meat that never warmed. The ships tacked slowly into the small, treacherous curves of ice drift, the helmsman swearing with the careful precision of men who had learned to set curses like wedges into tight joints. The shore was a dark ribbon under a white cliff, and the black smudges of men moved along it like the last ink in a well. The dead were not visible at first. The living are always visible before the dead. The living carry the flutter and the sound, and the dead are clever enough to let them be noticed until noticing is a habit and saving oneself is something that comes too late. They ran the boats in, and the first men leapt ashore with ropes that went taut at once and sang in that particular way rope sings when it is under too much strain. Arthur Dayne put his feet on Hardhome's stony shingle with a strange feeling in his legs, as if some old part of him that had never before come north had just set itself to rights in his body. He had always known desert wind and hot stone and sand that got into everything and stayed for days. This was another of the world's truths, and he took it into himself like a draught of cold water. He moved among the frightened people they had come to rescue with the same steadiness with which he had mounted the ladder at Eastwatch. He did not shout. He did not make grand gestures. He guided, pointed, put his body where it needed to be for the rope to come around the rock the right way, lifted a child by the belt and set him in the boat like a sack of meal without making the act rough. Behind him Ed's voice went on, laying a rope of his own across the day. "And if you step in that, you'll wish you hadn't. No one ever listens. And then what am I to do with a boot full of someone's breakfast? God's blast the man who invented boots. The first arrow that killed a dead thing took the top of its skull off like an egg, and it did not fall. The woman who had loosed it sucked air in over her teeth and went silent. The second arrow punched through a white's eye socket, and the creature stumbled and raked at the shaft and kept coming until a man with a seeks made of black glass stepped in and hooked its heel cleanly and cut its throat for good measure, because confidence is slow to learn when what you kill does not stay killed in the usual way. The first real fear should have risen then, but men had not yet laid hands on it. They kept working because work keeps terror from finding a seat. Things shifted very quickly after that, the way weather moves in the mountains. One moment manageable, the next moment a table turned over and plates everywhere. The dead came down off the ridge not in ranks but as a scattering that, when you looked again, was always nearer. Arthur saw them across a gray sweep of rock and ice, and he experienced one of those small, absolute moments in which a man knows the size of his life. He understood that all the tournaments and banners and songs had been practice and play and private griefs, and that what his hand knew of a blade had been learning for this, and his bones had been pacing toward this without his consent. He did not reach for dawn, which waited patient on its peg back at Castle Black. He drew the northern blade, and it came up as if it had always lived at his side. He was not a dancer now, nor a boy showing men that speed could make them fools. He was very still until he moved, and when he moved it was to the right places, no more. He listened for Ed's voice not because he needed it to know where death was, but because Ed's voice was a rope line through a fog that wanted to chew up everything steady inside a man. He listened for Tormund's laugh and for the steel hiss of darts loosed by women whose wrists were thick as ropes. The first of the Blue Riders came down the ridge line at a walk, because the dead do not hurry unless they do, and then it is too late. The rider's mount was a horse that had known fields once, and it lifted its feet carefully as if remembering, because something inside dead things remembers. The rider itself was tall and terrible, and not terrible, in the way a glacier is not terrible if all the world is as cold as itself. Its eyes were chips of a deeper winter than Arthur had ever seen. Its spear was of blue-white ice, and its blade was shaped like a talon. He stepped from the line without thinking about it. It occurred to him only after that he had moved like a younger man than he was. The rider watched him with a long, impersonal curiosity that contained neither contempt nor respect. He could hear Ed swearing behind him with a sort of intimate wail. He could hear the bark of Tormund's command, which had nothing of the fear in it because commanding was the free man's art. He could hear the great sea drawing its breath through ice. It was not a duel in the old sense of a thing two men will do to find out which of them may go home and which not. It was an interview. The other struck once, and the northern blade took the blow and sang and jarred Arthur's wrist up to the elbow with a cold so pure it was like music. The second stroke came faster, and he slid his blade along it and turned it aside and broke the spear's angle and cut. Cut not flesh, but a kind of brittle idea masquerading as a weapon. The spear's tip shattered, an old winter star as it breaks on the shoulder of a mountain. The rider lifted its head and made a sound like ice shifting on itself. It did not feel like victory. It felt like a question posed and an answer given that had not pleased. Behind Arthur Dayne men were dying the old ways and the new, with a gasp, with fights that are always private no matter how near the crowd presses, with little surprised words, with no words at all. He could not stay with the rider. The living pulled at him more strongly than the insulted pride of any foe. He stepped back into the labor with hands that bled through his gloves without his noticing. He carried 2 children under his arms as if he had been born to the trick. He jerked a rope around a rock and anchored it and did not turn when something blue moved at the very edge of his sight. He did not think of dawn. The longing to hold it surprised him. He had thought himself above that, which is one of the few prideful thoughts he still permitted. He thought instead of the oath spoken under cold timber and of the white wolf whose nose had touched his hand. He thought of the way Jon Snow's eyes had gone dark when he realized the full circle of the work. By nightfall they had taken off more souls than they had thought possible and fewer than they had hoped. That is what rescue means in a world that has learned the arithmetic of winter. White shapes lingered on the ridge, not pursuing, because cruelty is patient when it is certain. The ships turned into the wind as men prayed and kissed bits of wood that had belonged to better men than themselves and clutched jars of black glass arrowheads to their bellies as though warmth lived in them. Arthur Dayne sat on his heels on the deck with his sword across his knees and looked at the shore until it tore away into fog and then grew again in his mind. as things do that a man cannot allow himself to forget. He slept for an hour, sitting up, with Ed's mutter, a blanket thrown over the day. And that's all very well until you're hip-deep in smoke and none of the dead men will kindly stand where you can count them. If this is the work of heroes, I'll take the chores of cowards. Thank you. The soup's cold, of course. When he stood and stretched, his joints creaking in a pleasant way that promised later pain, he found the red woman watching him with a gaze like a nail hammered into something that has not yet been shaped. You should not look at men like that, he said mildly. It makes them into the shape you need and not the shape they are. She smiled. You are not so easily pushed into a mold, sir. I am nothing so brittle. E as a title, he replied. And I am no sir here. What are you then? A brother, he said, and he had not expected the small relief the word gave him. It made him feel as though he had put down a weight he had been holding so long he had forgotten it was there. The Snow King will need you, she said. He is too light yet for the stones men throw. Then I will stand under him and let them hit my shoulders, Arthur said. That is the use of old men who have done foolishness. You are not old. I am older than I was. When they came back to Castle Black, the yard boiled with movement that was not noise but intention made visible. The living who had been taken off the shore were herded with care that looked rough because men did not have time for gentleness. And then the gentleness appeared in small places because it must. A blanket over a child's head, someone using their own scarf for another's hands, a pot shoved under a little boy's nose with a brusque "eat that." Jon Snow stood in the middle of it with the calm of a man who had made his peace with the fact that the day would never be done. He counted on his fingers quietly as people were sorted, a trick to stop the mind from flying away. When Arthur passed him, he lifted his eyes, and the two men did not speak because speaking is not always the respectful thing between equals. It was in the days after, while the dead were being burned and the living were finding corners, that the matter which had been laid down like a thread in the back passage behind the hall grew into something men could see. Brothers who had not liked Jon's bargains with the free folk used the trouble to whisper. They did it without malice and with malice both, because fear is fertile and grows two crops in one field. The old customs of the watch were called upon like ancestors whose feet had to be bowed to even when the house was on fire. A meeting was called in the shield hall, under the faces of dead men whose eyes were made of paint and opinion. Arthur Dayne stood self-contained, neither apart nor pressing forward. He watched Jon Snow watch the room and saw the moment when the young man understood that his body could not be in a boat and on the dais both without tearing something that would take too long to mend. A brother with frost-reddened cheeks stood and put into clumsy words the thing the room had been leaning toward. A second lord to stand beside the first. Not a regent, not a rival, not a deputy. Words that carried old fights in their pockets like stones. Two commanders. Two men whose vows made new room for a custom that had not existed before because it had not been needed, or because men had forgotten it once existed, or because stories fall out of memory the way screws fall out of chairs that are used too often. Half the room bristled, because the watch's pride is in its stubbornness. The other half exhaled as if something finally felt true. When arguments rose, they rose like seabirds and wheeled, and then settled again when they realized they were too tired to do more than cry. Jon Snow stood and lifted his hand and the room quieted, because men had learned that he did not lift his hand to speak for the sake of hearing his own words. He spoke plainly. I cannot be at sea and in the hall, he said. I cannot make bargains with kings and measure rope for building cranes. If I try to be two men, my two halves will fight each other, and you will be worse served than if you had none of me. The watch does not have men to spare. It has me, and it has the man who came north with a skiff and asked for an oath. Put him in the chair beside me. Let the watch have two faces for one head. We will not be the first house to double our windows so that light can come in where it did not before. He did not look at Arthur Dayne while he spoke. The room rippled. Objection, approval, fear of novelty, love of it. A few men looked at Arthur with old things in their eyes, old loyalties, old hatreds. A man who had once lost someone on the wrong side of a Dornish sword scowled and then sighed because now was not then, and yet the hand remembers. A woman from the free folk with a braid thick as a hawser nodded once, as if counting coin. The red woman watched as if the room were a brazier and she were counting coals. "Do you accept?" Jon asked at last, turning to meet Arthur's gaze with steady attention. "No," Arthur said, and the word shot through the hall like a shot arrow. "Not as you've asked it. Not with the new chair a throne beside yours. I'll accept a thing that is less grand and more useful. Call me Lord Commander if you must, but right beside it Steward of the Wall, and let my writ run where yours would be best spared. Give me the stones and the ovens and the drills. Give me the ships and the lists. Let your voice be the one that runs south to ears that will not hear mine, and mine be the one that runs along these stones. When we disagree, we do it in a room with one window and one small fire. When we come out, we speak with one mouth, because this house cannot stand two tastes in its bread." A small smile touched Jon Snow's mouth. "You bargain like a king," he said. "I learned it from men who believed they were," Arthur replied. The vote was called, and it was not unanimous, because unanimity is a tyrant and the Watch has fought enough of them. It was enough. The old men grumbled and afterwards stood to shake Arthur's hand, because the world is difficult enough without refusing a man out of spite when you need his bones to stand under the same roof as yours. The younger ones looked as if something had been loosened in their chests. The free folk, pragmatic in their fierceness, measured what this meant for firewood and meat and not for pride. In the days that followed his second oath, "This one not ancient, this one a garment cut to fit as well as it could," Arthur Dayne said about the work. He made himself a map of the wall not just in miles but in habits. Ere men slept heavy and where they did not. Where the kitchen stoves cracked and where the wind made a whispering seam you could fix with canvas if you knew just where to lay your hand. He set the builders to a new plan of stair covers that could be raised by one rope and one strong boy instead of 3 men. Because strength is scarce in winter and cleverness costs nothing but time. He sat with Ed and argued not about soup but about placement. Whether a line of small shields nailed along the east parapet would take the worst of the wind off men who shot from there. He stood with the Red Woman at the base of a tower and listened to her speak of fires that are more than wood. He listened because listening is a blade all its own. He did not take dawn down often. Twice only did he take it from its peg. The first time, he took it out after the night in which it had not snowed and yet frost had formed along the edge of every blade in the armory, as if the air had changed its mind and wanted to be steel. He ran dawn's length along his palm, and it left his skin as cool as river stone at dusk. It did not burn. It did not sing. It remembered sunlight. He rewrapped it and hung it back like a man who has read a letter from an old friend and cannot answer yet. The second time was after the riders had been seen again near Icemark, where weirwoods stand clotted like old lace and the ground hums in some pitch that men cannot hear but their horses can. He did not unsheath it. He touched the leather of the grip and felt nothing but his own pulse. The first true argument with Jon Snow came over a matter so small that men who have never commanded would have laughed. Where to put a pile of fletched arrows so that men could reach them when they were shouting and afraid. Arthur wanted them on the second landing, nearer the door. Jon wanted them half a level higher, out of pilfering hands, because habit makes men fat-fingered with fear. They stood under the eaves with the wind pawing at their cloaks and spoke as if speaking were the careful laying down of planks over a widening crack in the ice. "You value reach," Jon said. "And you value control," Arthur replied. "Control keeps men alive. So does a hand that can close around an arrow when it needs one." Ed, who was pretending to drink from a mug and in fact listening with the avidity of a man who knew that this was where a house lived or died, rolled his eyes and said later to no one in particular, "We'll all be arguing about arrows while dead men come up through the butter churn." In the end, they put the arrows where Arthur asked and set a small boy to sleep near them, since small boys have sharp ears and shrill voices. And they agreed that the next time the smaller thing would go where Jon liked it, because the point was not to win but to work. They wrote these agreements down. Arthur had learned that men forget promises made in the cold when the sun rises and makes new promises. On the leather strip he tied with the note on Dawn's hilt, he added another strip with knots in it. Each knot a pact between 2 stubborn men. He was not gentle. He did not pretend there were not times he wanted to take a man by the shoulders and shake him until his teeth rattled. He did not pretend he did not sometimes wish for the old certainty of a command that, when given, would be obeyed because the hand that gave it wore the right color. He did not pretend, he did not sometimes lie awake with his eyes open in a room so dark the dark had texture, and think of a prince with a harp and another with a hammer and a woman in a tower who had smelled of blue winter flowers and blood. He did not pretend ghosts were not faithful. But when dawn came, he put his feet on the floor and rose and put his hands to the work, because the work had no use for the man he had been and had a desperate use for the man he could be. Winter did not come all at once that year. It came in notes. A higher wind, a thinner crust of ice on eaves, the taste of iron you get in your mouth before snow. The others came in notes too. A white thing in the treeline when no white beast should be abroad. A silence under the trees that was not the ordinary hush of winter, but a listening curved around the living like the palm of a hand. Ghost stood often at the top of the stairs, his nose lifted as if scenting a thing that left no footfall. The red woman smiled more and spoke less, which is a cause of worry if you know such women. One night Arthur and John stood atop the wall, their cloaks wrapped tight and their breath flying out in small plumes that looked irritated to be left behind. The stars were very clear, the way they are in air so cold it might shatter. The world fell away to either side of them like something a god had cut with a neat knife. This was built by men, Arthur said. His gloved hand pressed flat on the old ice as if to comfort it. It's hard to remember that when you're standing on it. It feels like the work of something that does not need sleep. It's a work of men because they needed sleep, John said. They wanted a night that was safe enough to close their eyes. There are kings made for tents because tents can be moved, Arthur said after a pause. Then there are kings made for stone. You are neither and both. You must go where the work goes and you must stand when the work needs weight. I am not a king, John said, almost automatically. You are a thing people look at when they are frightened and decide whether to run or stand. That is a king in all but the extra names. They fell silent. The wind changed direction and came in softer, carrying a smell that was not quite familiar and yet made the skin at the back of the neck prick. Do you feel that? John asked. His hand had gone half an inch toward the hilt at his side without his quite noticing. I feel a listening, Arthur said. He drew breath and let it out slow. And I feel our work sitting all around us like a city we cannot see yet. We will need to be twice as patient and half as certain. I don't know that I can be patient, John said. His voice did not complain, said only what was true. You have a rope tied to you, Arthur replied, amused. It is called your counsel. When you run to sea it will check you, and when you stand too long at the fire it will pull you out. What will check you? John asked. My own limitations, Arthur said dryly, and they both smiled at that. And Ed, John agreed, and the humor warmed them for a blink. They fell quiet again. Far below, the night moved over the forest in a way that was not the way of wind. A shape separated itself from the black border of trees and stood in the openness, tall and thin and very still. It did not step forward. It did not raise an arm or call out. It stood and watched the two men atop their wall. It stood a long time, long enough for the eyes of the two on the wall to water from the cold and for their feet to ache through their boots. It stood, and then it turned sideways and was gone, so completely that the world seemed to have to breathe again the breath it had been keeping while it was there. They are learning the shape of us, Arthur said softly. As we learn theirs, John answered. Then let us give them a shape that is hard to hold, Arthur said. A shape with two faces that speak one word. A shape that can sit in a chair and run to the sea in the same breath. A raven broke out of the treeline then, black arrow against a sky fretted with stars, and for a moment its wings beat around their heads as if it had come too close to the edge of the world and wanted reassurance that edges are worth it. Jon Snow put out his hand and the bird, foolish or brave, landed for a heartbeat on his glove and left one small, hot drop of something that might have been courage where its claws pricked his skin. Then it lifted and went, vanishing into a night that seemed larger than it had been an hour before. They went down the stairs with the careful tread of tired men and the certainty of men who know where the step is because they have made the step a dozen times. The watch breathed in its sleep and the dead did not breathe at all, and somewhere a man turned over and sighed a name he no longer remembered when he woke. Arthur Dayne lay down in his narrow bed and did not imagine a blue rider. He imagined rope. It ran from his wrist to John's, from John's to Ed's, from Ed's to a free folk woman with a laugh like fire, from her to a boy from the Vale who had told an untruth to buy himself a hard life, from him to a tired quartermaster counting nails with care, from him to a cook who had forgotten to complain for a whole hour because she had been busy ladling hope into bowls, from her to a red woman who watched and did not tell him what she saw. The rope ran around the wall as if it were a belt meant to hold the world's belly in, and it gave him a kind of sleep that was not ease but was something better. It was sleep with purpose. In the morning there would be lists. There would be men to bury and wood to count. There would be voices raised and then lowered and a dozen choices that would feel too small to be this important and would turn out to be exactly the right size for the fate of a house. There would be a sword on a peg that remembered something he couldn't quite name and a new sword at his side that had no memory at all and so was completely obedient to the day's needs. There would be blue figures at the edge of the world, counting them. There would be a boy who was not a boy who would put on his cloak and go out and make hard speech to three men who had forgotten why this house was built and would need reminding with rope and rules and carefully measured kindness. There would be a wolf who came to nudge his hand once and then went away without sentiment. There would be the involuntary exhalation of a dozen tired men at the moment when a good plan is agreed upon and the mind can turn from argument to work. There would be more nights on the wall where the sky knocked like a door and no one knew who was on the other side. He slept and rose and slept again, and in between he lived. The wall kept its silent counsel. The others moved as if they had all the time of the world to do whatever work it is the cold demands. In the courtyards of Castle Black, a new custom took root. Two voices speaking one law, two hands writing one list, two sword belts hung on one peg when their owners took bread. Men grumbled that it was not the way of things. Others answered that the way of things is to change when need asks. A small boy from the Vale sat on the second landing with his eyes half open and dreamed of arrows flying true. Ed made porridge and complained and saved three men with a remark he told no one about because men should be allowed to believe themselves saved by their own good sense if the result is a more careful hand. On a day when the wind dropped to almost nothing, the Red Woman came and stood by Arthur Dayne as he watched the youngest recruits drill clumsily with their shields. She did not speak at once. The silence had become a kind of courtesy between them. "You carry more names than you wear," she said finally. "So does everyone who has lived long enough," he replied. He did not look at her. He watched a boy adjust his stance and saw the exact moment when the new balance found the boy's bones. "Some names are burnt into the world," she said. "Some are scratched. Some will not hold. The Snow King." "John," Arthur said, and the interruption was gentle and firm both. "Your John, then," she allowed with the smallest smile, "is a name made of breath still. It may be blown out, or it may be breathed into a blaze. Fire is difficult. So is ice. I did not come here to be an instrument of anyone's prophecy," Arthur said. "I came because there is a wall and behind it is a knight that does not care for stories. And yet stories. Care for you?" she murmured, almost with pity. "You are a sword, and swords are always lifted by someone's hand." "I have my own hand," he said, and at that she laughed softly, not mocking him but enjoying the old confidence. "Let me use it while it is steady." "As you will," she said. "Just know that steadiness is a light. Look down." He did. The shadow cast by his body fell long and straight across the yard, cutting men in half where it lay. "You see?" she asked. "I see a shadow," he said. "Some men will stand within it and be glad. Some will step out of it and curse you for the cold. Be ready for both." "I have lived through both," Arthur said, and his mouth tasted suddenly of desert dust and a room hung with blue flowers. "The cold curses a man as faithfully as old love." She touched his sleeve then, a gesture so light he doubted it himself. "You grieve for what you lost," she said. "I grieve for the man who thought he knew what the losing meant," he answered. "I am less certain now. That is a kind of mercy, I suppose. Uncertainty is the God that never leaves you," she said, and moved away as one who knows performance and exits when the line has landed. He stood a while longer and then went to argue about the height of a new parapet with a builder who had been born in a place where people cut stone like bread. He let the man teach him. He taught the man in return that arrows need a clean line of sight more than a wall needs to be beautiful. They shook hands and felt the small lift in their chests that comes when men have disagreed, worked, and made something together that will keep other men alive. Near dusk, Jon Snow found him at the peg where two belts hung and gave him a piece of news with half a smile. "The men in the hall have started calling us their two winter faces," he said. "Apparently we frown by turns. They say it keeps them from getting too afraid." "I'd prefer they were more afraid," Arthur said dryly, and Jon laughed, because he knew the shape of the joke now. "We have a ride tomorrow," Jon added. "There's word a band has been seen near Whitetree with a fire that didn't burn wood." "Then we go," Arthur said. "You or me?" "Me," Jon said, and then, "No, you." He waited. "You. I'll stay and see to the new arrivals. If they come tired and angry and no one counts their blankets, I'll have a fight I don't need." Arthur nodded. He had expected to feel annoyance. He became unsettled when he did not drink enough of the cold air each day, but what he felt was relief, and then, on the heels of it, gratitude that he could feel relief without the shame that would once have accompanied it. He went to his bed and sat to lace his boots, and Ghost came and lay his head on Arthur's knee for the time it took to tie one knot. The wolf's eyes were ancient and unable to forgive or condemn. He had the calm of things that exist entirely within their nature. Arthur put his hand in the thick fur and felt the warmth there like a secret. The night outside set its thin teeth into the walls. The watchmen on the west parapet stamped their feet and recited rude verses in undertones to keep the blood moving. The shadows of two belts swung on a peg in the armory, nearly touching, moving apart, nearly touching again. Far to the east along the wall, men with blue eyes stood very still and listened to the wind say the names of their enemies, because wind always says what it must. Arthur Dayne slept and woke and buckled his belt and went out to where the horses were steaming small clouds into air that did not want to be breathed. He swung up into the saddle and felt the particular happiness of cold leather and a good horse under him and a day with work in it. Jon Snow stood at the foot of the steps and lifted a hand, and Arthur lifted his in answer, and for a moment 100 things could have been said that were not. They had no time for them. They had work. He rode, and the men with him fell into their places as if the places had been waiting for their feet. They passed under the arch and into the big white silence that was the world this far north in this year of their shared duty. Their breath smoked. Their words blew away. The trees took them in and hid them from men who would do them harm and hid those men from them, because trees are fair. The snow deepened and then thinned, and the light slid along the ground in strips where the branches made a patterned sky. He thought of the peg with the belts and the rope with its knots and the boy on the landing and the listening he had felt on the top of the wall. He thought of a prince who had loved to make the air move around a string and the weight of a sword he had not drawn. He thought of the moment on the shore when he had broken the point of a weapon made of cold and known that questions were being asked, and that he and the boy who stood beside him at the top of the world would have to find answers that would let men sleep again. And ahead of him, through the trees, a light moved that was not fire. He nudged his horse as a man does when he decides to meet a thing halfway. He did not look back because he knew what was behind him. A house that had grown itself a second face and was the stronger for it. A boy with a wolf and a count of blankets in his head, the rope strung through 100 hands. He rode. The trees closed and opened. The cold watched him with old eyes. He smiled, a small expression entirely his own, and went toward the light. The trees drew them in and pressed the sound out of the party until all that remained was the soft grunt of the horse's lungs and the dull clack of a stirrup striking a sapling in passing. Arthur took the lead because the woods did not allow a column wide enough for 2 men abreast, and because he was accustomed to putting his own eyes on the crease where a road used to be. Snow thinned under the spruce, a crust broken and refrozen a dozen times until it crackled under hooves like thin pottery. "Whitetree sits ahead like a knuckle," muttered the rangy builder who had come along to look for his own sign in the wood. A bent sapling, a pile of stones that meant something to men with hands. You go left of it and the land dips to a hollow where men who don't want to be seen can do a lot of being unseen. Which is another way of saying this is a good place to walk into stupidity, Ed observed. Fortunately, I'm with men who refuse to be stupid without writing it down first and asking 2 old crones to countersign. I asked 3, Arthur said, and the men closest to him smiled without moving their mouths. It wasn't mockery, it was acknowledgement. The rope of words thrown across a cold gap to make the crossing easier. They found the thing that was not fire just before noon, though in the old woods noon looked no different from morning. The air changed first, losing what little warmth it had with the suddenness of a candle pinched between fingers. Then a brightness came like hoarfrost on the edges of their seeing. The horses tightened their ribs under the saddle. Arthur raised a hand, palm out, and the column stopped as if he had reached backward and caught their bridles. The light moved through the trees as if the trees weren't there. It lay on bark and snow without throwing a shadow. It did not flicker. It did not smoke. It steadied itself in a stand of birch and gathered into a still shape like a spill of water arrested in the act of falling. Behind it, in the notch between 2 dark pines, something taller than a man watched in the same way the night had watched from the forest's edge weeks before, with an attention that did not contain feeling. "Do we talk to it?" the veil boy asked, his voice cracking despite his efforts to sit as still as the men he measured himself against. "We tell it what it needs to know," Arthur said, and slid his leg over his horse's neck and dropped to the snow. His boots whispered, the sound smaller than the hunger the cold made around it. He did not draw steel. Steel is an answer. This was a question. "We know the shape of you," he said into the thin air between the light and himself. "We know you don't love noise and heat and confusion. We know what you hate. The fault of a man who thinks he knows a thing is to stop learning it. I will not make that fault here." The light did nothing. The tall shape in the notch tilted its head a degree. Arthur felt, rather than saw, men behind him settle their weight onto their thighs, ready without readiness being panic. He lifted his hand and spread his fingers, not in peace, but as a man showing a dog his empty palm before asking it to heel. "We have built new fires," he said. "We have made warmth move. We have stored mornings and we know where to pour them. Come and feel that when you choose your night." He stepped back. The light thinned, like breath against glass wiped away by a careless cloth. The tall shape went sideways and was gone. "What in all good grave dirt was that?" Ed demanded, the complaint made gentle by disbelief. "If we're to start addressing lamps as if they're lords, I need to learn new courtesies." "Then learn them," Arthur said. "The things we fight are not men and they do not answer to men's old tricks. They test us. We test them. Each time, one of us learns which way the other wants to move." "And what did you learn?" "That we have very little time," Arthur said, "and that I must ask the builders to do an ugly thing at Eastwatch." He turned his horse and they rode for the road again, because the way back is sometimes shorter when the going becomes urgent. He had no desire to be surprised in the hollow the builder had warned of. They reached the white gate's trace in the late gray hour before sunset and saw a smear of sea beyond the trees like dull iron. The wind was out of the north now, carrying the smell of old ice the way a bad story carries a memory. By the time he strode into the plans room of the builder's hall, the maps had already been unrolled. Othel Yarwick set his square aside and rubbed his fingers together as if he were trying to remember the feel of wood through callus instead of through glove. John was there, cloak unpinned and thrown across the back of a chair. Tormund filled a corner with his breath, arms folded, mouth corked in tolerant amusement that did not reach his eyes. The Red Woman stood in the doorway as if that threshold had taught her all she needed to know about the room. Arthur placed his glove on the exact knothole in the table where Othel put his thumb when arguing. "Freeze the Bay of Seals," he said to the builder. Othel blinked. "Begging the wrong man's pardon. That's the other's work, not mine." "We break it," Arthur said, "which means we must allow it first. You have the drawings for your heat towers. You cannot carry them quickly enough into that mess if it stays water. But if the sea hardens, we roll them," Othel completed, eyes brightening with the old builder's joy that only came when a problem hurt enough to demand honor. "Damn the gods, you want to win a war with kitchen ovens on legs." "I want to win with what we have," Arthur said. We cannot find dragons in a week. We can find iron wheels. And fuel, Ed added. And men to push. Free folk, Tormund grunted before Arthur could answer. We know ice and we love a fight if it means we can keep our children breathing. We'll push and curse you for it and push again. Jon leaned a hip against the table as if he had already been standing too long for the patience of his bones. You want to let them have the sea to bring them onto the ice so we can break it under them. We break the ice around them, Arthur said, not the whole field. If we drop the whole skin, our men go in as quickly as theirs and die that much colder. We cut channels. We lure. We fire and retreat and fire again. Like trapping a stag, Tormund said, teeth showing in an involuntary appreciation of honesty. You've hunted. I've failed at it enough to learn to set more than one snare, Arthur said. We will line the channels with fire, and we will make lights. Lights? Athel asked. Mirrors, Arthur said. Not glass, polished bronze. Every kettle you can spare sacrifice to discs. Put them on ribs like sails. Aim them at the place where the sun will be. There's no sun to aim, someone objected. It sits on its hands at this season. Even on its hands, it throws a silver, Arthur answered. We don't need heat alone. We need confusion. We need glare. We need to teach their eyes a new lesson at the same time we teach their feet to fear a certain hiss from ice. Your cleverness makes my teeth ache, Ed said. Do it. I want aching teeth rather than chattering ones. Jon's gaze had gone inward the way it did when he ran down the measure of a plan from end to beginning. We need men to hold the line when the ice bridges start to fail, he said. We need a signal they will all be trained to obey without question. We need someone to stand in the worst of it and call the retreat too early if he must, rather than too late. Not you, Arthur said immediately, because he had learned the value of stepping into the gap before pride names itself duty. You keep the house. You hold the rope. They'll want to pull too hard, and you'll know when to let it give and when to make it bite the wrists. Tormund nodded once. He's right, boy. Jon did not bridle at the boy. He weighed the need, not the word. And you? I go to the ice, Arthur said, with Ed and your best fools. I have no best fools, Jon said. Only men who can listen and men who cannot. Then give me the listeners, Arthur replied, and the strongest backs. They broke apart into the business of preparation that had replaced prayer in this place. Athel went to shout at men about wheels. Steward Bowen, whose face had become a permanent arrangement of duty and dislike ever since the bargains with the free folk, began the count of wood they did not have and would find, because there was no other choice. Tormund sent runners to his people with a laugh like a drum and a list like a hammer. The Red Woman did nothing anyone could see, which, in her case, was always when she was doing something. Arthur went to the armory. He stood before the peg and the two belts hanging there and unbuckled his plain northern sword. He hung it beside Longclaw's scabbard and stood looking at the three of them as if they were a kind of sentence only his hand could read. Then he reached up and took Dawn down. The leather wrapping was stout and unremarkable under his fingers. He laid the sword across his forearms and felt again the cool weight, the way it gave nothing and promised nothing, and then, when he asked for movement, gave him exactly as much as he had earned. He remembered being young and learning its balance until his wrist could find the point with his eyes shut. He remembered the day a woman's hand had brushed the flat, her laugh low, and the smell of winter flowers in a tower where love and death slept in the same narrow bed. I'll need it, he said aloud to no one, because sometimes a man should say the thing that is true to the empty room so that his pride does not make him lie to his friends. You will, said a voice from the door. Jon stood there, not intruding. He had a gift for that. He could stand in a room as if the room had called him to be where he was. Arthur did not pretend the choice had been made lightly. He rested his thumb along the star scratched near the throat of the scabbard. You'll keep the house. Jon nodded. If anything breaks, I'll mend it. If anyone runs, I'll stop him. If there's a choice between mercy and habit, you'll choose mercy and you'll write it down so habit can read it later. Arthur finished, and they shared, for a heartbeat, the short, dry laugh that men who work together wish they could have more often. They went out to where Othel's towers were being mated to wheels. The things were ugly and beautiful both. Iron drum stoves riveted onto sled frames, with stubborn little chimneys that could lay down by a lever, and racks along their sides where men could hang pots to heat pitch or soup. The mirror carts looked like the inside of a rich man's house stolen and turned inside out. Bright discs lashed to timber ribs like scales on a fish from a story. The free folk who had never liked bright, Southron finery ran their hands over the polished bronze with the pride of makers. That night the sea froze. Men woke to it the way a house wakes to the first true thunderstorm of summer. All at once and full of opinions. The water in the barrels at Eastwatch had skinned over with clear ice the thickness of a fingernail. The bay beyond had become a sheet that pushed itself quietly out toward the deeper water as if a thing with intentions. In the hour before dawn, men ran across it shouting to hear the strange dullness of their footfalls and were pulled back by hands on their collars and curses in their ears. A boy's knife broke when he tested it on the new skin. Far out, in the clean new light that lives in winter mornings, blue figures stood and watched a house that had taken away their plan and turned it into its own. Arthur and Ed and the line of hulking, ribbon-tied towers went out from the gates like a funeral procession for something that had not died yet. The ice sang beneath the runners in a low note Arthur could feel in his teeth. Men with poles walked ahead, testing for treachery, and men behind pushed until muscle and bone began to complain, and then other men took their places because that was the way of it here. Tormund's people made jokes too filthy for the thin air to carry properly and sang snatches of songs that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with getting through a long morning. The others came just as the sun began to pretend at me. JHT rise. They did not charge. They never did at first. They began to walk, and the ice did not crack under them, though they moved in numbers that would have shattered a river in spring. Their blue eyes were the most honest thing Arthur had ever seen. They made no promises. They took no shame. Their spears came down like the memory of winter rain. Beyond them, the sea was only sky laid down. Stoves, Arthur said, and the first line of iron drums coughed and then roared to life with the sound of a secret rejoicing. Heat rolled out at knee-height, a bruising warmth that made men gasp and laugh before the cold stole the laugh away. On each tower, a man worked the lever that dropped the chimney to horizontal and sent heat sideways along the ice. The first channels began to appear as black tongues, and then as an alphabet no one alive had learned to read. Mirrors, he said, and the polished discs lifted, finding the pale line where the sun hid in the haze and twisting light across the field until everything shimmered with an argument that had nothing to do with fire or ice and everything to do with confusion. Weird, dazzling bands crossed the bay. Shadows lay wrong. The very line where a man might put his foot was called into question. Whites that could not think stopped. Whites that had once been sailors or hunters lifted their legs high, puzzled like cows brought onto a plank floor. The others looked up with a small inclination of their heads, and for the first time Arthur felt their attention strike him with something like irritation. Now, he said, and men who had learned to listen did what they had learned. They advanced where the black tongues hinted they should. They backed away when heat undermined their own weight. They drove iron into ice with the joy of people allowed to hit something that deserved it. Arrows went up, sounding for all the world like summer crickets against the cold. Dragonglass knives were the last word, thrown low and hard when whites gained too much of the dark tongue and had to be taught to sink. Cart toppled. Men recovered it with the stubborn patience of people who had decided hours ago to remain alive. Behind, you blind ancestors, Ed yelled. But what he meant was love. Behind! They yanked one stove out of a crack by main force. The thing squealed on its runners like a scolded pig. A free folk woman with a hawser braid took a position that had a man's name on it, and no one told her not to. Because this was the wrong morning for that old fight, and because she knew how to run a stove. The first other to come close slid toward Arthur on feet that did not touch the ice so much as remember it. He carried no spear now. He had watched Arthur break one and had learned. He held instead a blade that seemed to feed the eye wrong. Where it moved, the air changed color. Arthur raised Dawn and felt the old balance settle into his bones. It was not a question this time. It was the fare a man pays when he takes a certain road. The blades kissed once, and the cold went up Arthur's arm as if he had fallen into a river in thaw. Dawn did not smoke, did not char, did not do anything to please a story. It did what it had always done when asked properly. It held, turned, cut. It did not think the other into shards. It taught it a lesson in forces. The second stroke was not a stroke at all, but a slide and a twist, a master mason finding the right angle on stubborn stone. The other stepped back, surprised not like a man but like a law. Arthur followed, because you do not allow a law time to understand it has been questioned. Arthur, Ed's voice went square in his ear. You told me to shout if the left sinks. He split his attention in the way that comes of training a mind as well as a hand. The left had begun to drink the weight of men. He stepped sideways 2-3 paces, drawing the other with him. It came. They set their feet on a tongue that had gone glossy with a new skin of water. The other moved as if it had been born there. Arthur moved as if he had watched the sea from ramparts for a week and had practiced all the words it could say. The next bind carried them both to the brink of a black mouth. Arthur broke the bind and came back, allowing the other a step it thought it had earned. When it took the step, the black mouth widened. It did not fall. They do not fall. It thought its weight could teach the ice faithfulness. Arthur drove Dawn down and to the side, and the ice moaned like a beast, and the mouth opened its own mouth underneath the first. And then the other's foot went through. It did not flail. It simply was not there, and then half of it was and the other half wasn't. Arthur put his shoulder into the pushing of air itself and finished what the stove had begun. Half the bay heard the crack. The pieces of the fallen thing did not sink like a man. They lay under the skin, lighting it from beneath with an awful blue before dark water finally ate the light. On! Arthur's voice came out like iron. On! Men went on because they had learned that his on did not mean waste. They fought through a day that was shorter than the feeling of it. They fought until a dull gray glow behind the clouds gave up and left them with a thinner shadow to work with. They fought until the stovemen's hands blistered under their mittens and the mirrormen's shoulders ached from holding the disc on a line even when the line had only rumor to stand on. They fought until the others stepped back a pace in unison and the sound of 1,000 small things falling at once ran across the ice like a rumor. Enough, Arthur said into the cold that had tried to climb his throat and stay there. Back. The word tore him to say. He had never liked any retreat. He had learned to love the smart ones. Men obeyed because they had trained to obey, because the signal had been chosen days ago for this moment, because a horn's call rose from the right in the agreed rhythm that said stop low. Ving your courage and love your friends more. Ed swore at everyone and shoved a man's shoulder and smiled at another without knowing he had done so. Tormund dragged 2 people who had no business surviving and threw them into the hands of men who would ensure they did. They made the gate. The mirrors went down. The stoves were doused with snow and pulled under cover and beaten, as if they were men who had erred and yet deserved to live. The first man to laugh did it without permission, and everyone took permission from him and laughed, late and raw, each letting out the fear he had knotted between his ribs to keep warm. That night, Bowen Marsh moved. He had been a man of the watch too long to do his discontent out loud. He did it with speech that had the shape of duty and words that had been carved by old winters. He did it to men who had been tired enough to forget that habit is not virtue. He did it to a boy who looked up to him because the boy had never met a clever liar. He did it to 3 who were not liars at all but frightened and felt their fear as anger and their anger as righteousness. They came for Jon Snow in the hall when men were hunched over their food and thus less likely to reach their knives. They came with faces that wished to be noble and hands that were too hard. They came with a phrase about the old ways and how a Lord Commander must be made to remember that he served a vow older than this day. Arthur saw them the way a man sees a flicker of movement at the edge of a field he has plowed. An irregularity that will become something if left. He read the set of Bowen's mouth and the angle of his shoulder. He read the boy with the 2 wide eyes, the one he had told to sleep by the arrow pile, and he realized the boy had been listening to the wrong rope. He did not shout. Men who have done this work know that shouting tells a room which way to run. He stood without haste and put his hand on Bowen's forearm and said, quietly, for Bowen alone, "No." Bowen bristled. "The watch." "The watch will break if you do this," Arthur said in the same measured tone he used when telling a horse to accept a bit. "This is a knife at a table. If you put it down, I will say nothing tomorrow about how you picked it up. If you raise it an inch more, I will take your hand and the hand of the boy at your left, and I will be sorry to do it, and I will do it quickly and well. I will do it because you have forced me to choose between your fear and the life of a house that feeds 1,000 children tonight." Bowen's eyes widened with outrage. Arthur had heard men call it principle when it was offense at being named properly. "He's breaking our law," Bowen hissed. "He brings savages inside and lets women walk where women have no place, and he weighs us down with their hunger and calls it salvation. He brings a Southron knight and gives him a chair beside his own. What house is this? Not the watch I took my oath to. The watch you took your oath to did not have this enemy at its door," Arthur said. "It had time to practice old rituals and polish old phrases and count who had the whiter cloak. This house has no such time. Your law is not wrong. It is simply not sufficient. Put down the knife, Bowen. Keep your law. Keep it in a book where we can read it when we need reminding. But do not set it up like a god and feed it blood we cannot spare." For a breath Arthur thought he had reached him. Then the boy at the left, the boy with the open face who wanted so badly to be a man that he had listened to the wrong voice, lunged past Bowen's shoulder with a muttered sound that was half a prayer and half the voice of his own fear. He had a short knife. He was aiming, clumsily, for John's ribs. Arthur's hand moved without consulting the rest of him. He took the boy's wrist. He twisted. Something popped. The knife fell and hung there in the air as if trying to remember the hand that had held it. John had not reached yet. He had stood when the men approached, his face gone open and cold. He had not had time to be angry. He had had time to decide. He started toward the boy because John was always moving toward. Arthur said, in a voice that would have been a shout if he had not learned control, "Stop." The room stopped. Even spoons in bowls stopped. "Ed," Arthur said, not turning his head. "So I saw," Ed said from near the hearth, and his hand was already on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, lad. You'll want that wrist set while you still believe the world will be kind to you. Also, I'd like to be praised for catching the knife before it hit the floor. No one is going to praise me. Fine. I'll remember I did it, and that will be enough." The boy's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes filled. His arm hurt. Pain wrote its plain lesson across his face, and he learned something new. Bowen stood very still. He was old enough to recognize a path that led to a cliff, and he had been saved, in front of men, from walking over it. It is not an easy thing to accept salvation when pride needs punishment to feel at home. "Bowen," John said, and his voice did something soothed and honest that Arthur could not do. "You were wrong. Not evil. Not a traitor. Wrong. We don't have time for wrong right now. You'll sit with me tomorrow and we will decide together how punishment can keep our law without starving our hearts. Tonight, go and count blankets." For an instant Arthur thought Bowen would strike him for the softness of it. Then Bowen's shoulders sagged under the weight of a luck he had not asked for, and he nodded, unwilling, and went to count blankets because counting is easier than confession. Later, in the little room with one window and one small fire, Arthur and John stood as they had at the wall and allowed the day to sit quiet between them before they put words to it. "I would have taken his hand," Arthur said. "I know," John said. "That's why I needed you there, and why I needed to be me after you. We are doing this thing properly if we are both a little angry afterward," Arthur said. "It means neither of us got everything he wanted." "I didn't want a knife at my ribs," John said, with dry humor that took one hunger's edge off everything else. "No," Arthur said, "that I will try to prevent again." They knew it would not be the last test. It was simply the one the house could not afford to fail that week. The others withdrew to the white line where the frozen bay met the real sea and stood there a day as if inventorying what had been done, which is an ordinary courtesy between enemies. Then they turned inland, and the cold that ran before them came in like a story spreading. The tales at the way castles became consistent and then became urgent and then became the kind of tale men stop telling because telling uses air they have decided to save. "We cannot hold the whole wall with men," John said, when they sat with the maps again. "We need wards that don't tire." "We've been building them," the Red Woman said, with the small smile that meant she had been doing something no one else had to be troubled by at the time. "Your builders' towers are only iron and stubbornness. I like them, but they will not be here when you sleep. There are lines in this ice that are older than your oaths. They can be joined where they have fallen apart and strengthened where they have been worn thin." "And the cost?" Arthur asked, because magic has a way of sending its costs to someone else's tally. "A few things that can be spared," she said. "Blood that will not kill those who give it. Wood that is not good for burning. Some words that will taste foul in men's mouths because they were taught such words are unclean. A handful of choices that will make some hard men spit. If you give me leave, I'll lay the net along the middle mile. Night Fort to Ice Mark. If they break there, they will look for another way, which is all you ask of a net. If they test another mile, you will have time to run to it with heat and bronze." John nodded. "Lay it. I need a blade," she said. "One that remembers morning." Arthur understood. He hesitated. John looked at him. Their caution held for one steady breath and then yielded to the moment. "Will it change it?" Arthur asked. "It will be what it is," she answered, which was the only straight line ever to come out of her mouth, and he respected her for finding it now. He brought Dawn to the base of the wall that night with 3 men to carry the calls and a boy weeping because his fingers hurt and because he was 17 winters old. The Red Woman took the sword and ran her hands along the flat as if smoothing grease into a hinge. She did not sing. She spoke low in a language that no one used to buy salt or call his sister home to dinner. She pricked her finger and let 3 drops fall on each edge. They did not smoke. She leaned the blade upright against the old ice and, with a gesture like a mother spreading a blanket over a feverish child, she dragged her palm down the wall until a sound rose like wind finding a hole it had used when it was young. It was nothing to look at. It was everything to feel. The net went up in a line too fine to be seen, and yet the hair on the men's arms rose when it passed. The Red Woman smiled and did not let satisfaction show. "If they come," she said, "they'll find a memory here. You can lend it more with those ugly stoves and your bright discs. Come dawn. If there is dawn tomorrow, bring the mirrors and let them make trouble." There was dawn. It came grudgingly, but it came, and the mirrormen and the stovemen set out with their carts in a line that made Ed swear at the way their tracks would cause trouble later, and then swear himself into silence when the first light struck the first bronze and went slewing along the net in a shimmy that started as a trick and became quickly a law. Light bounced from disc to disc, harmless as a child's game until it hit the place where dawn had leaned in the night, and then it turned into something else that had no good name. It was not heat. It was not fire. It was not pain. It was all of those learned in one breath by creatures who had not needed to learn them before. The others came for the net because they could feel it and could not abide not understanding a thing they could feel. They hit it the way men hit a thing they can see but cannot reconcile with the shape they think the world should take. The front ranks slowed, not with fear but with fidelity to a rule that had just been written without their consent. Men on the wall, men on the ground, men on the ice, men on their first day and old men on their last. All felt the line take a weight beyond wood and iron. Arthur watched and saw balance change. The small, nearly invisible shift by which a fight becomes doable where before it had been hopeless. "We bring them to Night Fort," he said. "Make the old stories work for us for once." "About time," Ed said. "I've been waiting my whole miserable life to see an old story pay a single day's wages. They did not do it in a day. They did it over 3, and if any man tells you a great thing is done in a day that does not cost what 3 days would have, do not trust him with your back on a ladder. They fought along the net. They moved stoves as if the iron wanted to live and would help them if they spoke kindly to it. They set the mirror carts and adjusted them with the fine, absorbed attention of old women setting loaves to rise at exactly the right angle near exactly the right patch of coals. They dragged tired men away from work and threw new ones into it. They saved, at terrible risk, 2 carts that broke their runners because the carts were worth more than a dozen men in judgments no one wanted to have to make. They held the line. They let it bend where bending was clever and held it where stiff was needed. And they drew the front of the true enemy, the unwearied minds behind the lumbering bodies, to the place where the wall had teeth in its own stories and liked to bite. Night Fort had always been a wound waiting to open. It opened when the first of the others, older than Frost, stepped through the gate that does not look like a gate even when an old singer tells you where to look. The Red Woman laughed once, an ugly little sound that was all triumph and no joy. "There," she said, "there. If there was a door, there is a door." Arthur Dayne was waiting. He had not put himself there out of love of drama. He had put himself there because he went where the worst point would be, and John, learning quickly, had put himself where the line could talk to him from 3 directions and he could answer with the fewest words. Ed had planted himself at the pivot where stove and mirror and man and would all became one thing, and he could see where it might break first. Tormund had taken the flank and refused to let it turn in on itself as flanks do when they get scared. The other that came through the Night Fort's old mouth wore no crown and did not need one. It did not carry a spear or a blade. Carried itself. The cold that came with it was not pain. It was the absence of consideration. It stopped 10 paces away and looked at Arthur with the unsentimental patience of something that can afford to wait for weather to change. Arthur lifted Dawn in the small salute men who know the work give each other before they begin. The other regarded the gesture with scientific disdain. It moved first. It moved as if the world were a page and its blade were a quill writing an old, expected sentence, and Arthur's footwork was the interruption of a scribe who had learned to see his own errors. The first engagement did not decide anything. Tested as they always do. The second tested more. The third made a statement. The other could not get past him without paying. The fourth made another. He could not touch it directly without exacting the same cost from himself. The fifth stopped being numbers and became a language the two of them spoke without any of the men in the yard understanding a word of it but knowing the gist. That neither of them had fought the other's opposite before, that both of them were learning too fast, and that learning would kill many people if allowed to continue long. "Now would be a time for a miracle," Ed said conversationally to no one, and the Red Woman, standing too far away to have anyone hear her, smiled as if she had been rubbed with cold ash and said under her breath, "As it happens, the net along the wall thrummed like a harp. The mirrors threw in what small coin they had gathered from the thin sun. The stoves, laboring, blew low smoke that went flat along the stones. In the yard, a line of boys without beards held their shields at exactly the angle they had been beaten into remembering and did not run. Tormund's laugh cut across at the exact right time to remind men their legs worked better when they did not lock. Jon Snow came up along the rear of the yard with 10 men and placed them where they could see Arthur's shoulders and move when those shoulders moved. He did not shout. He did not need to. The white wolf appeared beside him as if carved there by a patient hand. The other stepped, just so, and Arthur recognized the pattern. This was where an old habit waits to be relied upon. He broke his own habit instead, and the other's blade slid past the place where it had expected a parry and came up under his arm, catching only leather because he had made his body a place where old rules did not quite work. He felt the cold then, true as river water in thaw. It reached and he refused it. He understood suddenly what he had not allowed himself to say aloud. That dawn remembered mornings because men had taught it to, that it was not a god or a prophet, that it was obedient to the man who asked properly and had the wrist to match the asking. He changed the angle. He gave up old names. He became simply a hand and a blade and the place where they met. The other looked, not surprised, but recording the new information as if it would be useful later. Arthur did not intend for there to be a later. "Now," Jon said, not loudly, but with a finality that took the guesswork out of the yard, and the 10 men moved not to the other, but to the 3 whites who had come through the gate at its kneecaps. They destroyed them with method. Tormund drove his flank harder so the line curved toward the gate and forced the field into a bowl. It kept the stoves low, the heat going outward rather than up. The Red Woman put her hand on the wall and said a word that was not for men. The mirrors found a thin embarrassment of sun and, for one sliding instant, light went across dawn in a line you could almost see. Arthur stepped into that moment as a man will step onto a boat that has pulled up alongside. In one move, no hesitation. His blade met a thing that had never loved light. The sound they made was not a sound. It was the removal of something you did not know you had been carrying. It made the hair at the napes of men's necks lie down and sleep. The other's blade split like a fall of hoarfrost under a boot heel. The creature drew back without panic, but with the acceptance that a line had been crossed it could not endure to have crossed again. Arthur did not give it the chance to test it. He came through in the shortest, ugliest cut he knew, the one no song would sing because it does not look like art, only like efficiency. He put the cut exactly where a thing's balance lives. The other stopped. It did not scream. It did not throw up its hands or curse his name. It ceased, the way a winter squall ceases when the wind shifts after you have convinced yourself the wind will never change. It fell in upon itself like a card house in a child's hand, and then it was gone. And all around the yard men staggered as if some great rope that had been tied around all their hearts had been cut.
Abaitingaos.
He followed the rule it had been obeying. Whites collapsed. The blue in the eyes that were not eyes went out like water poured on banked coals. The cold became merely cold again and not a policy. The net on the wall gave one last humming note and then lay quiet as old ice. The mirrors swung down. The stoves were banked and men touched the iron with the intimate gratitude men have for a tool that did exactly what it had promised. Silence bloomed. Then the sound came back into the world. The panicked bray of a horse. A man's sob from surprise rather than grief. Ed's voice sang, half astonished, "Well, that's one way to end a war without dying of old age first." It was not the end of everything. The world after the other in the yard lived on and needed men to do work in it. They still had to go out along the net and push down the stragglers the mind behind them had abandoned. They still had to burn what needed burning and speak the names of those who had gone down in the black mouths. They still had to heal the boy's wrist and decide what punishment kept Bowen's error from becoming a story other men told to justify their own pride later. They still had to cut wood and count blankets, which is how you know you're alive. But the big thing had been broken, and everyone knew it even if they did not understand whose hand had done it or what it had cost to learn to hold the blade the way it had to be held. The free folk cheered once, a sound that came out of old tribes and old sorrows and made men who had never loved them feel in their ribs a surprising answering warmth. The brothers of the watch did not cheer. They looked at one another and then looked away because they had trained themselves not to enjoy victory for fear enjoyment would make them poor guardians. Some of them let themselves smile when no one appeared to be watching, which is something. That night the yard became a place for names. Men stood under the wall where the red woman's net had thrummed and spoke in ordinary voices for lost friends. They did not want a priest. They wanted to share a mouthful of stew with a boy's ghost and tell him he had done well, and tell him to stop making his mother weep in her dreams and go and sit down. Arthur stood with them, not in front, not apart. John stood beside him. Ghost lay with his muzzle on his paws, his eyes open, his mind somewhere that made men think of snow falling on tracks that had been filled in by more snow. "Come," John said later, when the stew had gone cold and the last name had been given its place. "I have something to put down and something to pick up, and you have something to say and something you could keep unsaid. Both ways will be honest. Choose." They went not to the small fire room but to the top of the wall, because both of them had learned that the largest thoughts needed more sky to stretch under. The night was clean in a way it had not been for a long while. Stars sat where they should. The wind made nothing into something and then became nothing again. "I know who you are," Arthur said finally, and his voice was not a horn or a whisper. It was a man speaking plainly to another man who had earned plain speech. "I have known since I saw you walk through a door and fill a house. I thought I understood. I knew when Ghost put his head on my knee, and I felt a kind of rightness I had not felt since." He stopped there. He did not say the name. He did not need to. The winter flowers had already filled the air between them and then left it because perfume is polite that way and knows when it has done its work. John did not answer at once. He put his gloved hand on the ice as if touching a page he would not yet read aloud. "I know what men say I am," he said, "and what I was told I was. I know the old games of names. I have no use for most of them. If you mean to give me a higher one, keep it until the house does not need me to be what I am in it right now. I'll hear it then if hearing it helps someone sleep better. Not before." Arthur nodded. It was what he had hoped and what he had feared, which is how you know a thing is true. Then I will keep it, he said, not as a hoard but as a seed. If there comes a day when this house needs a different banner to stand under, I will bring that seed and plant it, and we will see what grows. If that day never comes, I will take it with me when I go to stand the last watch wherever men of our kind go. John laughed softly, the sound of a man relieved of a weight he had taught himself not to acknowledge. You bargain like a king, he said, and shook his head when Arthur began to object. No, let me say it. You do. And you fight like a steward, and you carry water like a builder, and you pray like a man who has broken both and knows how to mend. I needed you. It shames me to say so, which is ridiculous. It honors me to hear it, Arthur said, which is also ridiculous. We are ridiculous men. It is how we have survived. They stood a while longer. The stars did not blink. The cold did not bite. It sat companionably on their shoulders like an old hound. In the mornings that followed, the work felt lighter. It was still work, and lightness is relative on the wall, but men found that their jokes did not sound treasonous to their own ears. The free folk set up their tents in long rows and, with instruction and a considerable amount of swearing, took down half of them to rebuild them so that the snow would not bury a man in his sleep when the wind changed at 3 in the morning. Women came into the yard without the old fights starting up and stood at the ranges beside the kitchen men and taught them how to use horns for scoops and how to make a stew that had something in it other than resignation. Boys graduated from keeping the arrow pile to learning how to judge the angle of a mirror with a glance. Someone discovered a way to keep the stove chimneys from icing up using a bit of tin folded just so. Othel pretended he had known the trick all his life and then made the man who had thought of it carve his name into the first chimney with a nail so he would not forget. Bowen Marsh sat with Jon Snow and Arthur Dayne and Ed and Tormund in the small room with the one window and learned what punishment feels like when it is not vengeance and what mercy feels like when it is not permission. He took the old keys from his belt and put them on the table and took them back later with a face like a man who has had a tooth pulled and is glad it no longer hurts even though his mouth feels strange. The Red Woman laid more of her nets along the places where the wall had forgotten how to siege. She asked for small things. Men gave them to her because those small things had worked once and because, whether or not they liked her, they had learned to like that feeling. There were more fights. There were raids by what remained of the mind behind the whites, little probings at the net, in daylight when the mirrors were only mirrors, and at dusk when men's hearts slacken and mistakes become easier to make. There were funerals in small numbers rather than large ones. There were arguments about women sleeping in buildings set aside for men. There were arguments about whether to plant winter wheat in the thin soil near the shadow tower. There were arguments about whether to send a man south to ask for men they wouldn't get. There was a long quiet in which everyone learned to decide whether they believed this quiet meant the end or only a long breath. On a morning when the light came up clean and the cold allowed breath to feel kind, Arthur walked to the armory with a habit he did not intend to break and hung Dawn back on its peg. He stood looking at it for a while, the way a man looks at an old friend at the end of a long journey, grateful to have carried him and grateful to put him down. Then he took up the northern sword again because it did what was asked of it without asking questions. It was Ed who noticed the belt beside his. It swings in time, he said. Have you seen? Like they're hanging from the same nail. They are, Arthur said. We only pretend the peg is two. Good, Ed said. Two things being one is fashionable this winter. The first messenger from south came with a banner and a title and a list he expected to be honored because it bore seals. He asked questions in a tone that made even the polite feel less so. He asked who had commanded, who had struck the deciding blow, which lord it might please to be named as the benefactor of the news he would carry. He addressed Arthur as Ser and John as Lord and the Red Woman as Witch and Tormund as Savage and Ed as you. They took him up on the wall where a man's voice goes thin and his eyes water, and they showed him the net. They showed him the place where the other had gone to pieces. They showed him the yard where boys with shoulders still narrow held shields just right because they had stood there and learned to. They showed him the stove chimneys with the bit of tin and the carved name. They showed him the mirror carts, ugly and bright and serviceable. Then they took him to the armory and showed him 3 belts on a peg and asked him if the thing he wanted would fit in between them. When he found, after enough time to be polite, that it would not, They sent him down with an extra blanket and a better pair of mittens than the ones he had brought because southern mittens are jokes in the north. "What will you do when the South learns what happened?" the Red Woman asked Arthur that night as they stood near the door and watched the men who had put wood and iron and bone between the world and the cold they did not know how to talk about. "Nothing," Arthur said. "They'll make it into songs or into arguments. I am done with both. I will count tangles of rope and insist on the second landing for the arrows until I don't have to." "You'll die here," she said. "I hope so," he answered. "Far from men who would have me be the thing some story needs." "You will be a story," she said, not unkindly. "Then let it be a boring one," he said. "Let it be the one men tell their sons when they are tired and need to make the boy understand that the day's work is enough." She smiled, truly then, the first time he had seen it on her face. "It won't be boring," she said, "but it will suffice." Spring came late that year, which is to say it came when it meant to and not when men asked it to. It did not turn the world green at once. It laid water down everywhere and made mud out of 1,000 bad decisions, and then, one morning, someone looked out over the bay and saw the sea doing what the sea should do in April, moving without anyone telling it to. They sent a boat out just to feel would under them move that way again. And the man who took the second or cried and called himself a fool for crying, and no one argued with either claim. The free folk rolled their eyes and said boats were only good for fish and running away, and then half of them asked if there might be fish and the other half asked if they might, for once, not have to run. The answer to both was yes, and it tasted like fresh water and salt and relief. On the evening the first seals returned to the bay, fat and glossy and exactly as unrespectful as seals always are. John stood in the yard in a place that had been chosen by accident, a spot where the light from the stoves and the reflection from the mirrors made a small, comfortable confusion of gold and pale. Men had gathered not because they had been told to, but because they had begun to like the way their breath looked in the evening when they were standing close to other men they trusted. Arthur came and stood with them. "I've said enough words," John said, which immediately earned him a laugh because commanders never say that. "We did a thing. Men will say it was me or him or her or the gods or cleverness or luck. It was all of those and none. It was us. It was the RK you did and the work you did not do because someone told you not to and you listened. It was the way you argued and then did the thing you'd agreed upon. It was the way you let yourself be taught. It was not the way of a story. It was the way of a house." He stopped because he had meant to keep it short, and he had. He lifted his hand, and the room, the yard, the field, the whole strange house that had become a refuge for thousands, lifted their hands without meaning to. They did not cheer. They stood. It was enough. After, when the stew had gone around and the bread had been rationed in the fair way that makes a man feel as though he has been treated as well as any lord even if the loaf was small, John found Arthur near the armory door. They looked at the peg without meaning to. "2 belts, John said. "3, Arthur corrected. "Sometimes 4, depending on who needs a place for his weight to hang when he eats." John smiled. "Stay," he said. It was not an order and it was not quite a plea. It was an understanding, given voice. "We will have new fights. They will be smaller and more ignorant and more mean, and in some ways that will be worse. Don't leave me to them without the man who can remind me which arguments can be won and which must be allowed to burn out on their own." "I'll stay," Arthur said, "until you have a man who can do my part better. Then I'll teach him what I can and go see whether the world allows a man to fish and say nothing for a season." "You'd be poor at saying nothing," John said. "I am learning," Arthur said, and meant it. He walked the ramparts in the last light and listened to the wall's old breath. He ran his hand along the ice where the net had thrummed and felt only the quiet comfort of a house asleep with good locks on the doors and a fire banked rather than raging. He stopped where he had stood with John and watched the forest breathe under a sky that was finally not listening to anything but itself. Ghost came and stood with him, silent, warm. In the yard below, Ed cursed at a pot and someone laughed and Tormund told a story about a bear that had become more extravagant with each telling, until now it lived in a mountain and ate sheep whole and had learned to play a pipe. Children, actual children, small, muddy, loud, ran in a ragged line across the cinders and fell down and got up again, and no one shouted at them because the shouting hours were done. The red woman walked along the base of the wall and did not touch it. She did not need to. The thing she had needed from men was settled for the moment. Arthur Dayne looked east where the bay was, and beyond it, the untrustworthy line where the sea and sky shook hands, and west where land made its shoulder and let weather lean on it, and north where the world had come from to test them, and south where the old names slept. He did not feel pulled by any of it. He felt placed. It was an unfamiliar luxury. In time, Southrons came with questions and little gifts to make their questions easier to ask. They learned a new way to talk to men who did not want their little gifts. They went away and returned wiser, or did not return at all. In time, the free folk planted rye in places where rye had no business growing and made it grow anyway because obstinacy is the kind of magic they have always had. In time, men who had been boys learned to beat shields into the right angle without thinking and to pass their bowls without counting who had the best pieces of turnip. In time, the two belts on the peg became a habit so ingrained that men took it for granted that the house would have two faces, frowning and smiling by turns, and children who did not remember the one-faced days laughed at old men who said it had ever been different. On a morning when the light came up with a particular kind of promise it only shows twice a year, Arthur woke with the rest and put his feet on cold floorboards and felt, in a small secret place in his chest he rarely visited, an ease that had not lived there before. He dressed slowly. He buckled his belt without looking. He went out and took bread without ceremony and nodded to the kitchen man who had finally learned to salt stew properly. He walked out into the yard, where even the crows sounded a degree less offended. On the peg, Longclaw hung next to the plain northern blade he had grown to like for the way it asked little and gave much. Dawn hung where it hung, quiet as always. Men came and went, looked at it, sometimes touched the leather when no one seemed to be looking, and felt, for a heartbeat, that they were part of something that had started before they were born and would go on after, which is a human being's favorite feeling. John joined him. They did not speak. Speaking would have been rude to the morning. They stood and watched a column of steam lift from one of Othel's towers, now set permanently in a place where it could make men comfortable instead of only keeping death at bay. They watched the mirror carts stacked neatly in their shed, ugly as sins that had learned to do good. They watched Tormund teach 3 boys to lose gracefully because, he said, it would make them unbearable champions one day. They watched the Red Woman watch the world with a calm that was either satisfaction or the patience for the next crisis, which in her case amounted to the same thing. Arthur thought then of the rope with knots, and went to the little box where he kept his private measures of the work. He took it out and tied another knot. For a day when mercy had beat pride, for a stove that had refused to drown, for a boy whose broken wrist had healed properly and who now could string a bow without making a face. He tied it with hands that had done more killing than he allowed himself to remember and more mending than he had thought possible. He tied it and made it neat. "Breakfast is edible," Ed announced, the ritual praise matching the ritual complaint, which is a miracle on a level with the fall of an ice king. We'll have to build a shrine. Not a big one. A shelf. Perhaps a peg. 2 pegs, Arthur said. 4, John answered, deadpan. Fashion is getting out of hand, Ed sighed. We'll have to appoint a steward to argue against good ideas. I volunteer and resign in the same breath. I'm very busy learning to be happy, and it's taking up my whole schedule. Ghost thumped his tail once. The sound was uncommonly loud in the yard, and men turned their heads and smiled like men who had not had reason to in a span but now did not need permission. The day stretched before them. Wood to be stacked, walls to be checked for seams, a list of small complaints to be investigated, a line of newcomers to be told the rules that keep a cold house warm. The big work had been done, not forever because nothing is forever, but for now. The rope held. The belts swung toward each other and apart, their rhythm comfortable and unremarked. The wall stood and breathed, patient as a thing made by tired men who had decided to go on being tired for a good reason. When evening came, the sky put a clean blue between the first stars that made even the hard men in the yard look up as if remembering something they had liked as boys. Arthur and John went to the top because they could. They stood where they had stood before, and the wind passed by like a friend on his way to a different errand. Far out on the bay, a seal slapped the water and a dozen crows answered back as if they had been waiting for that specific conversation. The forest lay like a cat that had decided finally to sleep with all 4 feet tucked under. The south waited with all its nonsense and all its grace. The north held. Between them stood a wall with 2 faces. Arthur Dayne rested his hands on the old ice and let the feeling travel up his arms into a place behind the breastbone where a man keeps his faith when he loses his certainties. A bell rang for the last meal, and for once no one came late because for once no one had to wait to make sure the enemy was going to do the thing everyone had learned to fear. He looked at John and John looked at him and they nodded. A simple gesture that looked like 2 men saying grace without needing a table. They went down the steps together, keeping time by habit and by choice. The last of the light slid along the seamed face of the wall the way a gentle hand strokes an old dog. The doors shut and the bars slid home and the house breathed out. It was enough. It was more than they had expected. It was theirs.